why is democracy so difficult? Why is it historically so unstable? Well, at least three reasons why it's so difficult and so unstable are first, majority faction. And this is just a permanent problem in any democracy. Majority faction is when you have a majority with a common interest that is contrary or adverse to the rights and interests of a minority or to the long-term and aggregate interests of the whole community. And it's obvious to see why this one is a permanent problem because democracy is majority rule. So, as Madison argues in the Federalist Papers, the best you can do here is to mitigate against the worst effects of majority faction. The second problem is called the Socrates problem, and this is the problem with powerful orators who can whip up emotion and passion in the crowds and move them toward mob justice, such as Athens killing Socrates or forcing Socrates to kill himself. And then the third big problem, and the subject for this video, is the Hannibal Dilemma. And the Hannibal Dilemma is at its core about crisis. How do governments, how do democracies handle crisis? And what we're going to discuss in this video is how does the American system of government attempt to solve for the Hannibal Dilemma? Now, other countries have their own solutions, but we're speaking specifically about how the U.S. Constitution tries to solve this dilemma. And this is a structural dilemma. So it's a constitutional, a structural answer. So in order to understand the Hannibal Dilemma in the American context, you actually need to look backwards to Republican Rome. This is before Rome is an empire, before Caesar's, just Rome, governed by a Senate. And Rome has a powerful enemy in Carthage, which is a city-state on the northern coast of Africa. And one of Carthage's most famous citizens is Hannibal. And we're talking about Hannibal with the elephant. So Hannibal has a remarkably audacious plan to cross the Swiss Alps with elephants and attack Rome from the north. They'll never see it coming, so they make it across the Alps, though very few elephants do, and they are now making their way to Rome, killing as they go, and this is a crisis. So how is the Republican Senate supposed to respond to this? Well, luckily, the founders, the creators of Rome, understood that there are certain characteristics inherent in a Senate. Deliberation, talking, that's all good, but that's not great in a crisis. In a crisis, you need energy, speed, dispatch, decision-making ability, crisis management. And those are the characteristics inherent in an executive, in a president, in a king, in a dictator. And thus, Rome had a provision for a constitutional dictatorship who would step forward to replace the Senate. The Senate would step aside to handle a crisis. This dictator would take on extraordinary, though not unlimited, powers, and then step aside when the crisis was abated and the Senate would reconvene. Now, these two things did not coexist at once. That's the important thing to know, is that the Senate steps aside and in comes in the constitutional dictator. Okay. Now, this works in the case of Hannibal. Hannibal is chased off. He loses this campaign. But over time, the institution of the constitutional dictatorship will so morph and crises will become so frequent, including in the form of domestic strife, of civil war, that eventually you will have a permanent dictator called Julius Caesar. And thus begins the reign of the Caesars and the end of the Roman Senate as any kind of substantial body. So we've learned a lesson here. We've learned that democracies are in fact unstable and that in a crisis, you need a dictator. You need an executive with extraordinary powers, and that these two things, for some reason, don't seem to be able to coexist. And that if you have to choose between the deliberative might of a Senate and the energy and the decision-making capacity of a dictator who can keep you alive in a crisis, you're going to choose life because it's better to be alive than it is to have rights and be dead. So we enter an era of kings, of dictators, of emperors. Now, of course, there's still going to be some pushback to this throughout the history of Western political thought, but it's really not until you get to Montesquieu, for example, that people begin openly pushing back against the idea of the unlimited king. So Montesquieu has this idea of power as a big vat, and just giving this big vat of power to the king leads to abuse of power, pretty obviously. He says, what if we reconceive political power? We say there's a legislative power, the power to make laws, and because it is a distinct power, it should exist in a distinct body. And then there's the executive power, the power to administer the laws, and because that's a distinct power, it should exist in a distinct body. And then there's the power to adjudicate on the basis of the law. That's the judicial power, and because it's a separate power, it too should be a distinct body. So this is the idea of separation of powers, taking that big vat and separating it out into three different branches. Now, Locke will step in and say, actually, there's a fourth type of political power, and that's the federative power. It's the power to interact with other countries. But this power naturally folds into the executive power. So under that separation of power system, the executive power actually has two types of power, the federative power and the natural executive power. Now, these ideas don't stay in Europe. They make their way across the Atlantic, and they are well known among the founders of the United States. So by the time you get to the end of the Revolutionary War, you enter a period of constitution writing. This is the critical period between 1783 and 1787. 11 of the 13 state constitutions will be rewritten, and they'll be rewritten on the basis of the political thought of Montesquieu and Locke. You're going to have separation of powers. You're going to have a legislature, an executive, and a judicial. Now, key here is that you will have strong Congresses and weak governors. With the exception of New York, the executive in the separation of power systems in the respective states will be weak. Why? Because you just threw off a king. You're not going to welcome in another king. So we are not yet okay with powerful executives. We will be by the end of this. And we're not yet afraid of the dictatorial capacities of legislatures. We will be by the end of this period. Okay, so that's the situation at the state level. What about the national government? Well, you have the Articles of Confederation. USA 1.0, as Akhil Amar would say. So USA 1.0 is as weak and incompetent a form of government as you can imagine. It has no separation of powers. It's not following on the examples of the states. It's just a unicameral, that means one chamber, a single chamber of a Congress, one state, one vote, lacking any kind of substantial powers such as the power to raise an army or regulate interstate commerce or even negotiate on behalf of the United States. So those are the two dichotomies, and there's going to be a series of crisis and of tough lessons that the states are going to have to learn that will lead us to the convention in 1787. And the first is that without a powerful or capable executive, whether that be a governor or a president, you can't handle crisis. The chief example of this is Shay's Rebellion. So Shay's Rebellion, Massachusetts, you have a bunch of farmers who are angry because they're in a lot of debt and they can't pay their taxes, and they say to the Massachusetts legislature, either lower taxes or print paper money. And the legislature says, no, sorry, can't do. And these 3,000 farmers take up arms and march on government building. This is an armed insurrection. Well, can the governor of Massachusetts put down this open warfare in the state? Well, no, because he's a weak governor. Because, like most of the states, well, all of them with the exception of New York, you have a weak governor. He lacks crisis powers, so he can't do anything. Can the national government do anything? No, because there is no chief executive and they don't have any military powers. So national government can do nothing to help. What stops this crisis is actually a group of wealthy Bostonians hiring basically a mercenaries, a private militia to put down the armed insurrectionists. So that's the end of that story. Then you go to Rhode Island next door, and Rhode Island has seen what's happened in Massachusetts, and they say, oh, not going to do that. So when the farmers come to the state legislature and say, print paper money, Rhode Island says, sure, will do. And they start printing paper money. The problem is this paper money is worthless. And so a cobbler is not going to accept paper money in exchange for shoes with a farmer. And the farmer's going to say, hey, state legislature, make the cobbler stop being mean to me. Make him accept the paper currency. And the state legislature will say, yeah, sure, cobbler, you have to accept paper currency. And if you're the cobbler, you're going to say, no, and you're going to close up shop and you're going to leave the state. And the economy of Rhode Island is going to collapse. So you have two things here. You have a crisis that can't be solved, and you have dictatorial legislatures who are absolutely stomping all over the rights of the people. So if you are the founders, and this news spreads rapidly throughout the state, you're going to start panicking. James Madison, in particular, is going to look at Shay's rebellion and look at the disaster in Rhode Island and say, oh my, all of the warnings given to us from ancient regimes on the dangers of democracy are coming true. You have dictatorial legislatures, and you have armed insurrection. You have civil war tearing apart the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. All of the warnings are coming true. How do you prevent the democratic experiment in the United States from collapsing? Will you go to convention, 1787, and you say, we've learned some tough lessons about how to make this work structurally, how to handle crises, and how to handle overbearing legislatures. So you're going to look at separation of powers. You're going to create a new constitution for the national government based on the state constitution, involving separation of powers. No more unicameral legislature. You're going to have a legislature, an executive, and a judicial. And unlike the states, you're going to create a powerful presidency. Now, where's my proof for this? Well, if you look at the language, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, you'll see that all legislative powers herein granted are vested in one Congress of the United States. That phrase, herein granted, is absolutely essential. Congress does not just get to hold the sacred legislative orb. It gets to touch the sacred legislative orb on certain occasions, those that are listed, enumerated, or implied in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Now look at Article 2, which is very short in comparison. It simply says, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. So, the executive power, no herein granted clause, just the executive power. So the sacred executive orb is just given to the president. Now, this makes sense because in a democracy, power sucks like a vortex into the legislature. So you actually need to limit the legislature and constitutionally beef up the presidency to keep them independent and co-equal. Same thing with the judiciary. So this is separation of powers at the national level. But we've also learned that that's not enough. You need to take the second step, which is checks and balances. Now, checks and balances is taking these three separate branches and overlapping them like a Venn diagram so that they have overlapping powers, gray areas where they have to fight over. And you're going to grant to each of these institutions certain offensive and defensive weapons to use against each other to prevent encroachments from the fellow branches. So the idea is a strong Congress can fight back against a strong presidency, which can fight back against a strong Supreme Court. You need three powerful, co-equal branches. Self-interest is going to play an absolutely essential role in making this system, separation of powers and checks and balances, work. So here's how. Nancy Pelosi is the most powerful Speaker of the House in 100 years. You need Nancy Pelosi, an incredibly ambitious woman, to know that her own personal power is attached to the power of Congress, that she is only as powerful as Congress is, and therefore she has personal, self-interested incentive to protect Congress from encroachments by the courts or by the president. And you need Joe Biden, a remarkably ambitious man, to know that his own personal political power is attached to the power of the presidency. He is only as powerful as the presidency, and therefore he has personal, self-interested incentive to push back against any encroachments by the courts or by Congress. This is how you keep our institutions independent of each other and co-equal. Our system only works if you have a strong Congress, a strong presidency, and strong courts. Now, key to this system is institutional thinking. You need Nancy Pelosi to be thinking as an institutionalist, as a member of Congress, and not as a partisan, not as a Democrat. And you need Joe Biden to be thinking more as an institutionalist than as a partisan. Now, one of the best examples of the separation of powers system working is during the FDR administration. So, Great Depression is on. FDR is the god of the Democratic Party. He has majorities in both the House and the Senate. And he's passing bunches of New Deal legislation. But the problem is this pesky Supreme Court keeps striking it down on constitutional grounds. And FDR says, they are thwarting the will of the people. Who are these unelected gods on Mount Olympus to stand between the American people and the legislation that they want? And so he proposes a plan. Pack the courts, increase the size to 16. I'll just put all my friends on it and they'll never say no to me ever again. stops this plan? Why is the court still at 9 and not at 16? Well, it's the Democrats in Congress that stop this plan because they think institutionally and not as partisans. They say, hold up, Congress has the power to increase the size of the court, not the president. And if we increase the size of the court because you ask us to, you will become too powerful relative to Congress and the Supreme Court. They're thinking about protecting the independence and the integrity of their separate institutions. So they say no to FDR. Democrats say no to a Democratic president. And then the Supreme Court does what the Supreme Court does best, which is roll over and they stop striking down New Deal legislation anyways. So everyone is happy, it works out. The institutional system is preserved. When members of Congress think institutionally, they can prevent the president from becoming too tyrannical and vice versa. So think institutionally. When you think institutionally, you are thinking systematically. You are thinking about separation of powers and checks and balances. And if the voters will think institutionally, then members of Congress and the president will think institutionally. And right now, frankly, our problem is a weak Congress. It's not a weak president. We need Congress to become powerful again. And in order to do that, Congress needs to think institutionally, not as partisans, but institutionally. My last example of institutional thinking is 2022. Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House. She knows she's going to lose the majority in the upcoming elections. So she strikes one final shot across the bow for congressional power relative to Taiwan. So the president has dominated war and foreign policy for decades. But then Nancy Pelosi decides that she's going to visit Taiwan. Now, clearly, China is not going to be happy about Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives, visiting Taiwan, a country that it's not even supposed to recognize and is an independent country. Joe Biden will say to Nancy Pelosi, don't go, you can't go, don't do it. That's a bad idea. I'm telling you, you can't go. And Nancy Pelosi is going to say, oh, I'm Speaker of the House of Representatives. I can do whatever I want because Congress has war powers and foreign policy powers co-equal with the president. You can't stop me. And Joe Biden will admit as such in a public message, basically apologizing to the Chinese, I can't stop her because our Constitution allows her to go. So she will go to Taiwan. Now, whatever you think about Nancy Pelosi, whatever you think about her specific decision relative to Taiwan, that's not the point. The point is Nancy Pelosi was thinking institutionally. And because she thought institutionally, the power of Congress grew relative to the presidency. That is absolutely essential. Congress needs to get stronger compared to the presidency. Until Congress gets stronger, until Congress becomes truly a co-equal branch of Congress by thinking institutionally and not as partisans, our separation of power system will continue to fail.